With great power comes great responsibility. A phrase coined by Voltaire, Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt, FDR. Well, each of these dignitaries at one point said something to that effect. They recognized the power that either they themselves held or officials around them held, and they knew that without caution, power can lead to destruction. Indeed, with caution, power can lead to destruction. David is inaugurated as king of Judah and Israel, the two no longer divided, but now a united monarchy. The elders of Israel in the north came to him and said, David, this is in chapter 5, by the way. We read chapter 6. I just want to catch us up. David, we are your bone and flesh. We're family. We're related. In fact, they were not. David was from Judah, the south. But it's the sentiment that counts, right? In ancient Near Eastern, mi casa es su casa. Or something maybe more like, David, we really like you. We want to be on your side. Please don't hurt us. And who would object to that? He gets to be king. David had already been anointed king as a young boy. He'd made a name for himself, harpist for the king, shepherd boy turned Goliath slayer, wanted dead by the king, yet somehow still married his daughter, best friends with the king's son, ate the holy bread of the presence, preserved the king's life when he could have taken it 2 times. And so, to borrow another preacher's language, David led a ragtag group of 600, was faithful, obedient, patient, anointed king, and now begins his reign. David's first order of business: take Jerusalem from the Jebusites. And as any good, self-respecting leader of a people would do once conquering that city, David names it after himself, the city of David. And it's a good political move. At Washington, D.C. of sorts, Jerusalem is neutral to Judah and Israel, sort of in the middle. Neither nation will feel as though the king resides in the other's land. A united monarchy, we can all get along. Then there's some difficulty in chapter 5 and verse 8 in understanding what it means for David to hate the lame and the blind, that they won't be allowed in Jerusalem. We'll return to this later. David continues his political prowess and develops relationships, both politically and intimately, by marrying women of other nations, even women from Jerusalem who were Canaanites. Little side note, Moses, back in Deuteronomy, reminded his people, this is in chapter 7, that they are to utterly destroy a number of nations, having no mercy, because thus says the Lord, and you guessed it, among these nations are the Canaanites and the Jebusites, who are now intimately involved with David, or he's chosen to intimately involve himself with some of their women. And while we may have questions about the will of God in these texts, what is David doing? One thing is clear regarding intermarrying with these people, David ignores it. However, these relationships provide the united monarchy with some external support. King Hiram of Tyre even sends some goods to David that is going to end up building him a house. David's a wise guy, and I don't mean that in the derogatory sense. He knows what he's doing as a political leader. He is making relationships and alliances with people in the means that people in his day did, and he's doing it well. After hearing about David's conquering of Jerusalem, the nearby Philistines go on the offensive because they see his ruling of Jerusalem as a threat. They attack twice. David both times seeks the Lord, first in determining what he should do. Both times the Lord promises to give the Philistines over to David. David didn't let the first victory of conquering them get in his head and cause him to think, oh, I can do this on my own now. God helped me with the first one, but I'm king. I can do this. The second time, he goes back to God, seeing what he needs to do. Both times, the Philistines are given over to David in victory by the Lord. The model of King David saw should have led him to take matters into his own hands. Saul wasn't quite the same kind of king as David. Yet David's first action when needing to know how to respond to the Philistines seeking his life was turning to God. The Lord wanted victory for David. In verse 12, David then perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. The NRSV, a translation that almost every single professor in undergrad and graduate school for me has been their choice for translation, uses the term perceived, the Hebrew word that I learned as to know. The ESV and the NIV translate the same word as knew. So we have David perceived that the Lord established him as king over Israel, or David knew that the Lord established him king over Israel. Eugene Peterson in the Message says David came to know that the Lord established him king over Israel. When discussing whether or not the Lord establishes one as king over a nation, as the nations are warring against each other, I would hope that one would do more than perceive this to be the case. That seems a little iffy to me to just, I think God has made me king over Israel, and in doing so I can now go and fight these other nations. Either way, whether David perceived it, knew it, or was just assuming, he was just a better king than Saul when it came to defeating the Philistines. He did it as a young boy when Saul couldn't do it. He took down Goliath. Saul lost the ark to the Philistines. David, as we heard earlier, is going to get it back. David also, here, when he defeated the Philistines, again, 2 times, drove them from Gibeah, which was Saul's own hometown. So it's kind of a little slap in the face to Saul that you couldn't get this done, but here I am, the obedient king, doing it. These 2 men are not the same kings. But still, we can ask, do David's political moves fall in line with God's will? Or are they a result of an accumulation of power and an unchecked ego? One thing is certain in the text: David is the antithesis of Saul as king. David's relationship with God is founded on anointing and obedience. God and David trust each other, and as a result, God gives David power. With great power comes great responsibility. David is certainly superior to Saul in every respect, and so far, mostly so good. Where I want to focus this morning comes next in chapter 6 that we heard David read. David here sets out to bring the ark of God to Jerusalem. Some scholars tie 1 Samuel 4 through 6 to 2 Samuel 6. You all went through 1 Samuel 4 through 6 a number of weeks back, I believe, before I was back here. They tie these together as thought to be possibly 2 texts that were one originally. In 1 Samuel, it's the losing of the ark by Saul. In 2 Samuel, it's David retrieving it. In 1 Samuel, the ark is captured by the Philistines. They defeated the Philistines defeated the Israelites, killing 30,000 soldiers. In charge of the ark at the time was Eleazar, Abinadab's son. These are important facts. In 2 Samuel, David gathers 30,000 men. Just like the 30,000 that were defeated, David gathers 30,000 of his own men here in 2 Samuel. And Uzzah and Ahio, also sons of Abinadab, take charge of the ark. Eleazar was the one who was in charge of it before. He was probably the oldest brother. We're assuming something unfortunate happened to him, and his younger brother's now taking over. And after seeing how the Philistines transported the ark, which was on a cart, David followed suit. After all, carts are much more efficient than human beings with legs walking around with things made of wood and gold with stone tablets in them. Problem is, there's this thing called the Torah. And it's something like a book of instruction. Funny thing, it says that the ark must be made using these certain poles made out of certain wood with some gold around them. They go in these specific rings, and this is how you carry it. It's kind of like fine print. The thing is, carry is an operative word that these men somehow skimmed past. You're all stand-up people, I know. You would not do such a thing when you have fine print. Neither do I, of course, ever skim past such things. These men did, however, and so the Philistines building an ark looked like a good idea to the Israelites. And so they get some oxen, they hook them up to a cart, and you got to imagine, it's beautiful. They've seen the arks that the Philistines are making, and they want to do a good job too. So it's got all the bells and whistles. And they're pulling this beautiful ark that they've made, and the oxen stumble, and what do you know? It's teetering up top, ready to fall over, but Uzzah, bless his heart, puts out his hand and steadies it. For some reason, the Lord's anger was kindled at this, saving the ark of God, and God struck Uzzah dead on the spot. It's really a heartwarming story, wouldn't you say? Like any self-respecting king, David gets rid of the ark, which we'll get to. But first, to David's credit, this is one of his first acts as king. There's been a little mishap, but he's bringing the ark to Jerusalem to be at the center of his nation's religious and social life. Yahweh will be at the center of Israel's worship, both figuratively and literally. David thus far could have lauded himself for all the great things he had done. He's again been the antithesis of Saul as king already. But he knew it was God who had delivered him and his people. David was right to bring the ark back initially. David was also in charge of this great return. So when Uzzah did his best to protect the ark, David, who played the role of king and priest, that we find out later because he was wearing the ephod that we heard David read about. It's a priestly garment. David is playing both roles, king and priest. David should not have allowed the ark to have been transported by cart. David, playing king and priest, should have known better. There's no excuse for skimming the fine print when you're king and when you're priest. There's no excuse for doing things your way because you've made a name for yourself. There was probably an oh well for Uzzah's life. Whoops, forgot about that part of the instruction book. But I don't think we should let David off the hook for Uzzah's death. Uzzah's job was to bring the ark to Jerusalem safely and in one piece. And he did just that, even touching the very place God's presence resided. But when he touched the ark, he died. When people with power enact their will, even though it may align with God's will, in this case it was for God to be at the center of worship for Israel. It was David bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. Even when David is enacting God's will, he's also doing it according to his own methods. When people in power like that enact their will according to their own methods, there are costly ramifications for their actions. With great power comes great responsibility, and David fits right into this motif, but he doesn't live up to its declaration. David's now questioning the whole ark thing. He's upset with God. Who can blame him? His party ended abruptly. His parade didn't finish its procession, and frankly, the whole thing was just a little embarrassing when he was bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. Clearly, he needs to rethink this plan. So he entrusts the ark to Obed-Edom, the Gittite. He's going to take some time away from it, clear his mind, think things through. Obed, we'll call him for short, is from Gath, a Philistine city. So here's David, not sure what to do with the ark, after one of his men just died touching it, sending it to a Philistine. The same people who just got rid of it after they were bouncing it around back in 1 Samuel from Philistine group to Philistine group to Philistine group, because every place it went, loads of people were dying. And so they realized this thing is not the best thing for us to have in our possession. We're going to get rid of it. David says, well, maybe we'll just give it back to these people. They might know what to do with it better than I do, when clearly they didn't know what to do with it. So we can ask, what's David doing? Is he trying to send the ark to a neutral party while he figures out what to do with this sacred box? Because he's the one that should be bringing it back to Israel. He's the one that should be bringing it back to Jerusalem. And he is now sending it away to someone who really doesn't want anything to do with it. It seems like the easy way out. Interestingly, when Obed has the ark, Yahweh blessed his house. This is a stark contrast to the previous Philistine ark holders who saw destruction and death when they held on to it. Obed is either lucky or seems to have handled the ark in a correct way. David followed in the path of the previous Philistines by transporting the ark by cart. Obed may be onto something. When David hears of the blessings Obed is receiving, he decides to retrieve the ark. David comes to understand the dynamics at play when handling the ark, that with great power, literally in your hands as it should be carried according to the Mosaic law, comes great responsibility. In 1962, Marvel introduced the world to Spider-Man. Part of the origin story of Spider-Man is that once Peter Parker was bitten by that radioactive spider and he realized his superhuman powers, he decided to use those powers to further his professional career, to make a little cash. One night after coming home from his first TV special, he was walking back home and he allowed a burglar to run past him. And security guards chasing after the burglar, and he yells out to who he sees as Spider-Man, stop this burglar, stop this burglar. And Spider-Man's response was that catching criminals wasn't his job. A few days later, when Peter returned home, he found out his uncle, we have a slide for this too. If you can read the words, they're great. But it's a great image. When he returns home, his uncle had been shot and killed. His uncle's murderer, that burglar whom he apathetically let pass a few nights prior. In Stan Lee's Amazing Fantasy, issue number 15, Spider-Man says, "My fault. All my fault. If only I had stopped him when I could have, but I didn't, and now Uncle Ben is dead." The narrator says, "And a lean, silent figure slowly fades into the gathering darkness, aware at last that in this world, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. And so a legend is born, and a new name is added to the roster of those who make the world of fantasy the most exciting realm of all. And the legend of Spider-Man goes from there." Peter's initial plan was to take advantage of this new power, to take care of his aunt and uncle and himself. But now that his uncle is gone, he realizes, and he knew that he could have done something about it. He realizes that with this power, he can't just think about himself and a couple of other people. He has some responsibility in caring for those who have less power. David, does he have a similar sort of power realization as Peter? I'm not necessarily making that claim, but this time when he's getting the ark again in the sequel, Return of the Lost Ark, David reverently handles the power that comes with it. Every 6 steps the ark carriers took, David made a sacrifice. Now this might be an exaggeration because, let's face it, that'd be a lot of oxen and fattened animals every 6 steps from the city they retrieved it to Jerusalem. Either way, David dances and rejoices. And boy, does he dance. He's king, but remember, he's wearing this priestly garment, the ephod, which perfectly normal thing for a king to do in his day, to kind of wear this and play both roles. Just visual imagination for yourselves. The ephod he was wearing apparently hung from the shoulders, a garment that kind of goes down somewhere about the waist. That was all he was wearing, folks. There's nothing else. So remember, David's dancing, leaping, jumping, cartwheels, I don't know, somersaults, maybe, handstands in front of the ark like people, have you seen this, like gymnasts often do in front of monuments and other breathtaking sites popularized on Instagram and Facebook where they do a handstand. We'll never know what all David was doing, but it's sure to be that this was a take your breath away kind of sight. But first, before we continue along this procession, the point must be driven home that David is not Saul. King David. Yes, the king Saul was supposed to be, but took off on a choose-your-own-adventure kingship. Saul somehow chose an adventure that wasn't even offered in the choose-your-own-adventure book, because somehow God ended up regretting making Saul king. Saul was at times successful, but not in his obedience to God. Saul took total control of his life, causing himself to lose his seat on the throne. He even made the final decision of his adventure, how his life would end. When David became king, he didn't opt for the choose-your-own-adventure. Rather, he chose the do what Yahweh says adventure. And so back to the ceremony, David displays his exuberance before the Lord as Michal watched from a window. The last time we heard of such a setting, Michal in a window, again back in 1 Samuel, she was lowering David out of a window by her own strength, saving David's life from her father Saul, which is quite a depiction of a woman in the Old Testament. For people that don't often get agency, here she is, the one physically with her own strength, lowering David out of a window. More on her agency in the Old Testament. When they were wed, Michal and David, she chose him. She wanted to marry him. And so she is an interesting figure in these stories with the voice that she lends and the power that she exercises. Michal sees David jumping, dancing, leaping around as he's bringing the ark back into Jerusalem. Looking out of the window, which reminds us of the previous time she lowered him out of the window. She confronts David when he gets back. How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. Michal's words are choice. In 1 Samuel 4, when the Philistines first captured the ark, the daughter-in-law of Eli, again a woman, says, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Michal's use of the word honor is a play on the word glory. And we have a slide for this as well, just for visual. She uses the word honor as a play on the word glory. They're almost identical in Hebrew. Similarly, her use of uncovered in relation to David's intimate parts plays on the word captured from the same passage. So we have honored and uncovering, and I put those kind of in, well, you see, our passage is up top, before back in 1 Samuel's below, honored and uncovering, glory and captured. In Hebrew, those words, honored and glory, uncovering and captured, sound similar. So the author is doing something with these, wanting you to remember that when the ark left, the glory of Israel departed. And as David brings the ark to Jerusalem, Michal is making the claim that perhaps the glory is again departed in the way he's dancing. And as she claims, uncovering himself, similar to the ark being captured. The ark has once again been captured, this time by David. And Michal isn't so sure he's handled it all that well. She isn't too impressed with David. She's his wife, and he's being a little free with himself. But David defends his actions, as one commentator put it, as pious self-humiliation before Yahweh. However, when David danced jubilantly before the Lord, allowing himself to be exposed, he compromised his relationship with Michal. Did David actually uncover himself intentionally before his servants' maids? Did he actually honor himself? Was that what he wanted to do? Michal seems to think so. If we take David at his word, he did all of this out of reverence for God and with humility. Either way, he still makes Michal pay for her confrontation. He still causes a rift in their relationship. He makes her pay for her confrontation. In chapter 5, all the tribes of Israel, as I mentioned before, told David that God appointed him shepherd over Israel. And David wants to remind Michal of this, of the calling that has been placed on his life. He says to her, "God chose me in place of your father. God appointed me as prince over Israel." David's reminding Michal of who's in charge. And it's interesting that David doesn't use the aforementioned shepherd language that the folks of Israel mentioned about him, which would refer to a more humble position, shepherd. Rather, he uses language of prince. He plays the king card. "I danced before the Lord who chose me to rule, not your father. You think this was disgraceful? I'm just getting started. But those maids you spoke of, in their eyes, I will be honorable." Verse 23, "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death." David ends his verbal comeback there, but their relationship would remain permanently severed from that point forward. David refrains from sexual relations with Michal, leaving her unable to bear children. The daughter of a king, the wife of a king, interestingly referred throughout 1 and 2 Samuel as the daughter of Saul, though when she's married to David, she's referred to as the wife of David, which emphasizes something about her relationship to David. But now it goes back to the daughter of Saul, emphasizing the now distance in their relationship. Michal, the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, will not be the mother of a king. David makes use of his power, rendering Michal effectively single, motherless, almost shameful for a woman in her day. From material riches to existential rags, the author forces Michal to exit stage right, never to make a return, not present in the curtain call, with no mention in the credits. Worship may have been in order, given the occasion. But should worship have happened in such a way that it came at the expense of others? Could David have worshipped in a way that would not have left Michal embarrassed in front of other women? I guess we'll never know that if David had worshipped differently, maybe Michal would have been okay with the festivities and how he handled it. Or maybe she would have despised him regardless. Perhaps there's more there that we don't get to know. Either way, it remains. God chose David to be the shepherd of Israel, one who calls and guides his flock to and from safe pastures, safe from harm, protected from enemies. We see David's obedience to God. We also see his exploitation of power. It seems that the author presents Saul's and David's actions in these texts as contradictory, depicting Saul's actions as disobedient and David's as obedient to God's will. If this is the case, there's good reason for such a depiction. David is clearly the better king, more successful economically, politically, militarily, popularly. The nation is united and doing well. But what if the author is looking back on what has happened historically, or at least in the author's mind, and attributes the success of David to the blessing of the Lord retroactively? Just consider for a moment. If we interpret these stories through the lens of Jesus, the Jesus that we know who is presented to us in the Gospels, what do we make of domination of other peoples? The exclusion of some. Hatred of the lame and the blind. A single man, not in the relationship status column, David has many wives, but in the decision-making column, a single man and his God determine all that happens in and around Israel and Judah. David is clearly the good guy in these texts. But does that mean he's without problems? Like any good narrative, even the protagonists have their complexities. The king we claim to follow is the shepherd of us, his flock, as Jesus teaches in John 10. This shepherd king is the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. No one takes it from him. He lays it down of his own accord. He has the power to lay it down, and he has the power to take it up again. He brings the sheep into his pen, safe from thieves and bandits. He is the gate to this pen. He is salvation. Salvation is through him, for it is him. The good shepherd comes that his sheep may have life, abundant life. Once again, in John 10, he lays his life down. No one takes it from him. In John's gospel, it is very clear where power rests. It is in Jesus from the Father. And so we have two shepherd kings presented to us. One is pretty good. He's on the right track, but he's had some struggles along the way. And who wouldn't? He's human. The other, he's the definition of good, so it's not really a fair comparison. He is the Son of God. But back to the lame and the blind, whom David hates. In getting rid of them, David won't let them in Jerusalem. It says David hates them. David cleanses Jerusalem from its defilers. Obviously, this was a different day than it is for us today, and the idea of the lame and the blind, or anyone with something that we would consider some sort of illness, whether physical or mental, we would consider deplorable today. Would be outright disgusting for us to consider these people defilers. But there's a parallel to Jesus, who upon entering the temple in John 2, Jesus clears the temple of cattle and sheep, money changers, and those selling doves, the defilers. Jesus says, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Yes, worship God. And from the same gospel, Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her, this adulterer, this defiler of her day, this person who is other. Jesus flips the script when he comes. David wants to cleanse Jerusalem of what he thinks is defiling. Jesus does the same when he enters the temple. His Father's house is a house of worship. On Thursday, Great Britain voted to leave the EU. I want to read just a short excerpt from a front page New York Times article that was published the same day. The campaign, run by one of the loudest proponents of leaving the UK Independence Party, flirted with xenophobia, nativism, and what some of its critics considered racism. But the official, more mainstream Leave campaign also invoked immigration as an issue, and its slogan, "Take Control," resonated with voters who feel that the government is failing to regulate the inflow of people from Europe and beyond. From the New York Times, June 23rd, Stephen Erlinger. Take out immigration. Insert any divisive topic, whether religious, political, social, anything that when you hear it brought up in conversation, you have a knee-jerk reaction. You don't even have to give it a second thought what you know, what you believe about this topic. What's interesting is that take control, which was the mainstream slogan, take control is what people with power say. Take control is what people who want power say. Oddly enough, when we encounter Jesus as the shepherd king who has the power to protect his sheep, the power to raise a man from the dead, the power to make the blind to see and the lame to walk, the power to somehow save the world from its sin, when we encounter this Jesus, he lays down his life for others. Jesus doesn't just have power. Jesus is power. Yet he gives it all up. He doesn't say, take control. He lets all of it go. As followers of Christ, we have been called by Jesus, sent to serve others, just like the disciples. We have been given the Spirit, the power of God within us. And with great power comes great responsibility. David wants to make Yahweh the center of Israel's life. He places the ark in Jerusalem, the city that unites both the north and the south, the city millions of people since have considered a kind of home. David is a complex character. He makes things interesting for us. And so in many ways we can learn from him. But Jesus and his power, his control, we see this giving up of control, this great responsibility in the midst of great power when we remember the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, God on earth in human form. The very being of God in the flesh, the one with the power to say, let there be light, and it was so. The one with the power to deliver a people out of the hands of the Egyptians. The one with the power to establish his people in the land promised to them. The one with power to bring hope through a young woman who births the Savior of the world. The one who has the power to conquer all kingdoms and authorities. The one who lays down his life. This is also the one who has the power to raise it up again. A hope beyond imagination. But he gives it all up. Will the communion servers please come forward?